There's a lot in it to be concerned about. It's easy to get discouraged in a moment like this where you see forward progress that's been made, pulled back. I think it's helpful to kind of ground ourselves in the reality that the world of policy is a shifting ground and a pendulum that swings.
Educate, inform, inspire. The Dan Parsons Show, a podcast that lifts up instead of tearing down.
Hey, welcome to the Dan Parsons Show. I am your host, Dan Parsons. Hey, coming up on today's show, Becky Gould, Executive Director of Nebraska Appleseed. But before I introduce Becky, a shout out to our friends on Facebook. In particular, the page All Politics is Local, run by Jason Christensen. Daniel Windham posted this about the Dan Parsons Show. Look at the wonderful community coverage and work this guy is doing. Allison Armstrong then weighs in, Dan Parsons, you are a priceless gem in our state. Hey, thanks so much, Daniel and Allison. I'm humbled by your kind comments. We are building a remarkable community here, and I couldn't be more excited about your support. So thanks so much. Hey, follow us on Facebook and check out All Politics is Local. They're doing a great job of highlighting centrist politics here in our state. Okay, here's my interview with Becky Gould, Executive Director of Nebraska Appleseed. Enjoy. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome Becky Gould, Executive Director of Nebraska Appleseed, to the Dan Parsons Show. Welcome, Becky.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We've known each other for a while, and I thought it was about dang time that we get you on the pod. So, well, let me do a little bit of introduction. Becky has been with Nebraska Appleseed for more than 2 decades, most of that as executive director. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and her law degree from the University of Nebraska College of Law. And Becky helped me out with the description of Nebraska Appleseed, but here's how I would describe just briefly. Since 1996, Nebraska Appleseed has championed justice and opportunity for all Nebraskans. They address complex issues like child welfare, immigration, healthcare, and poverty through a systematic approach, working in courthouses, the state capitol, and communities across Nebraska. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, that's a great summary. We try to focus on some of the toughest problems facing Nebraskans and work in partnership with communities to make positive changes. So it's been an exciting job to be a part of for the last 23, almost 24 years.
Wow. So you've seen most of the history of the organization. So tell our listeners and viewers how you got involved. What was the impetus for young Becky to raise her hand and say, that's the group I want to spend my next couple decades at?
Yeah, I wish it was that intentional. Like many people, you kind of go through with ideas of what you might want to do. I really, coming out of law school, knew that I wanted to do something that was helping and supporting the community. I knew I wanted to, try to use my skills to make my home state a better place. But I really didn't know much about Appleseed. And I, at the time, was working for just a startup internet company as their office manager. And while I was, job searching for legal jobs, and a friend of mine sent me the job position at Appleseed and said, I think you might be interested in this. And so I applied and got hired, and I was the first full-time staff attorney hired by Appleseed. They'd had a part-time attorney working, and I dove right into doing litigation work around public benefits programs. And so that was back in 2001. And, I sort of fell into work I loved and continue to love, and didn't really know that's where I was headed.
Well, and you've been responsible with your team of growing Nebraska Appleseed from those early days to maybe give our audience kind of a little overview of the size of the organization, the reach of the organization, and whatever else maybe I'm missing.
Yeah. So we're now an organization of 47 staff. And so back when I started in 2001, there were 5 of us,
Wow.
6 on a good day, about 3 full-time, 3 part-time staff. And so, since that time, we've grown a lot. I think that growth is attributed to us kind of finding those issues where there were a lot of needs and a lot of opportunities to create better policy that would help Nebraskans, and finding ways to do it in partnership with a lot of other organizations and people, and to the point where people wanted to invest in our work. Our budget at this point is just right around $5 million. And we, put most of that into our staff and a mix of folks on staff. So we have about half of our staff are lawyers, and the other half are community organizers. And so folks who are out connecting with people in the community on a daily basis, really trying to keep a pulse on what are the needs, what's happening to folks across the state, and how do we translate needs and opportunities into policy, whether that's, as you mentioned, going to the legislature to try to change state law, or going at the federal level to Congress, or sometimes, you have to go to court to enforce a law, or to get an interpretation of the law that makes it clear, so that you can help folks, or that the laws hopefully help folks in the way they were intended.
Fascinating. I think for a lot of us who are involved in public policy, familiar with the name Appleseed, Nebraska Appleseed, and maybe familiar with some of the high profile issues and projects that you're involved in. But yeah, some of that day-to-day stuff, there's a lot to it. So, well, let's dive into this, Becky. Let's talk about some of the issues that you are dealing with, and some of the things that that most of our audience is following as well. We've been following some of the activity with the recent ICE raids here in Nebraska, and the whole immigration issue. We've said very passionately on this program that the Trump administration, when they came in, and for years President Trump talking about this issue of immigration, that they simply wanted to get the bad people off the streets, right? The murderers and the rapists and the worst of the worst. And but we've seen fairly obviously that that's not what's going on in America today. Granted, yes, those people are being apprehended and brought to the courts, but it goes way beyond that. And so anyway, your thoughts on Appleseed's role in, I guess, the broader issue of immigration, but specifically the recent enforcement activities by ICE.
Yeah, it's really a distortion, as you're describing, of a narrative that says one thing and a reality that's something else. And there was just some data that came out actually breaking down, the numbers of folks who have been detained by ICE, and the vast majority, have never had any criminal charges, or interactions with law enforcement. We at Appleseed have worked on immigration policy for really the last 20 years. And I think, one thing that's really important to ground the conversation of immigration in is the fact that our current immigration laws haven't been updated in almost 40 years. It's 39 years since we had any adjustments. And that's really the problem of why we are where we are. you don't end up with a situation where you have a lot of folks who are in the country without documentation because you have a functioning immigration system, right? It's because we don't have a functioning immigration system. And we have folks who are coming because of family, folks who are coming because of education, folks who are coming to work. And we have a system that isn't really working for any of those groups. And as a result, you have, what we've got right now, which is a lot of folks who are in a variety of different kind of limbo-like situations given their immigration situation. And when you respond to that with harsh enforcement, and what we've seen playing out in our own backyard, what we've seen playing out around the country, it's a really mismatched response to a problem that we all own, right? As Americans who have, kind of built these systems. And so we have a system that doesn't work great. And our response to that is to be really hard on people who are trying to navigate that system.
And sorry to interrupt you, Becky, but also those communities right here amongst us, whether it's agriculture or the service industry or, the meatpacking industry here in Nebraska. I mean, there's just jobs after jobs after jobs that immigrants are filling that we need help with. And, Nebraska is a great example of that. One of the most lowest unemployment rates in America. And in the communities that those immigrants have come. And we've been a very welcoming state. Lincoln in particular has been a very welcoming community to immigrants for generations. And then now to see those communities living in fear and trying to navigate this. So anyway, I just wanted to get my commentary in there.
You are absolutely right that we are a state that needs people. We have huge workforce demands that are not being met by the population we currently have. And so we're a state that needs immigration. And so, I think that's one of the other sort of contrasts of this moment is at a time where our, state economy and our communities are trying to grow. And we, as you noted, have really low unemployment and there's just so much opportunity to grow. We are stymied by not having enough people. And immigration can be part of addressing that challenge. And so one of the pieces that we've worked on, we are part of a large coalition that's called the Nebraska Alliance for Thriving Communities. It's a group that includes business leaders from all different sectors of business, as you mentioned, agriculture, healthcare, service industry, and as well as advocacy groups, faith leaders. So it's a really broad-based group of folks who have come together out of this shared recognition that we have a system that is outdated and not functioning, and that as a state, we need it to work. And we need to make changes to it at the federal level. And so the group has been, working on some shared policy ideas, meeting with our members of Congress to really push for changes in our federal immigration laws. And
how's that coming along?
Well, it's one of those things that I think, it sometimes gets lost in the mix that there's actually been for a really long time a lot of bipartisan agreement on what the system fixes are. And what gets in the way of it often is politics. It's a political narrative that leaders sort of struggle against. And so, part of the job of this coalition is to try to cut through that and say, look, this is a very practical problem that has very practical solutions, and that's where we need to have our focus. And we can't lose in the mix that our entire delegation just voted to give a huge amount of money to more enforcement
Billions.
Doing any changes to the system, to the immigration system as a whole. And so I think, how's it going? Not great. because that's not the outcome that is really going to benefit Nebraskans or our communities. The outcome that we need is to change these laws that allow folks to come here and work, that allow folks to come here and be with their families, and help meet the needs that we have in our communities. And, and I think you could say, well, it's not going well. Maybe we focus on something else where we could make a bigger difference. But our job at Appleseed is to stick with the things that are the hardest. And this is one of them. And it's part of why we've worked on it for 20 years. And it's part of why we'll keep working on it until we get to the finish line. But it requires advocacy, and it requires, not just Appleseed and the other organizations that are a part of this alliance, but everyone across the state to weigh in and say, this is what I see in my community. This is what I see as the opportunities we have. And we need you as our political leaders to, fix the immigration system and update it to meet those needs.
That's well put, Becky. I've watched, as we all have, ICE agents rounding people up, and these ICE agents, certainly aren't trained to the magnitude of, say, an FBI. Most of those FBI employees are very well educated, could make a ton of money in the private sector, and yet they're committed to federal law enforcement, but in great training. And these folks who are being hired by ICE, and again, they're having to ramp up and hire people, as you mentioned, the big beautiful bill. I think it was $45 billion with a B dollars for ICE in the years ahead to hire more agents, and so the fact that we're ramping all that up, and in addition to that $45 billion, I think there's another several $billion for construction of new facilities to house people in. And again, I think there's beginning to be, and you don't feel that you need to comment on every political thing that I bring up, but I've seen some polling that the people who maybe voted for this immigration crackdown are beginning to have second thoughts, because they were told, like the rest of us, hey, our priority is rounding up the worst of the worst. And to make the quotas, I've seen the figures of 3,000 people a day. There aren't that many bad people as immigrants in this country that have those criminal records. And so the crime that these people have committed, as you noted, is the fact that their paperwork isn't being expedited enough because the system is broken. And so I'm beginning to see that there's a pushback on some of this from a political perspective, that, hey, this isn't what we voted for. This isn't what we signed up for. My neighbors down the street were apprehended in the middle of the night. My kids' playmates at school are living in fear. So anyway, I think there's obviously a lot of work yet to be done, and it's a very perilous time.
It is, and I think there was some recent polling that just came out kind of showing that shift in where Americans are in focusing on deportation in particular, and the harsh enforcement. And there has been a huge shift. And I think, it's one thing to hear folks talking about what's needed, what's going to happen. And it's a different thing when you have a front seat into the reality of what it actually looks like to detain people. And, I think there's plenty of space for people to be frustrated or have questions about, how we got to where we are in terms of having people here without documentation. And that it's a good question to ask. It's a good dialogue to have. But I think even folks who, might be frustrated or have questions don't want to see people harmed. Yeah. They don't want to see people persecuted. Yeah. It wasn't, I talked to Nebraskans all across the state, and, really good. We're good people. We want to see our communities thrive. We want to see people taken care of. And so there's a reality playing out that stands in stark contrast to what our values are,
Yeah.
at least as Nebraskans, and I would hope as Americans. And I think that's what's driving some of that shift is, even folks who had questions, were frustrated, now have even bigger questions about what is this very, militarized looking presence going after folks who just don't have paperwork.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's why we need our leaders to now deliver on the other half of what they've been saying, right? The conversation, the political space has been, we can't address the laws until we deal with, what's happening at the border. I think now, arguably, they've passed legislation that addresses, we would say what they've passed wasn't needed. But, now that they've taken a step, where's the other side of it? Where's
Right.
the other half? We got to get to that. And I hope our, federal delegation will now step up and be leaders in that conversation. How do we expedite fixing our immigration system so that folks can come here and work?
Yeah.
And contribute to and stay here and work.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. To grow our state as we all want.
There's a lot of rules that don't make sense in that system. Some folks who are coming here on a temporary visa, they're allowed to bring their families, but their families aren't allowed to work. Why? Does that make any sense? No. So there's lots of really common sense things that we can fix and we should fix, and we need to do that as soon as possible.
Yeah. Well, sticking with federal issues before we turn to the state issues, Becky, just your thoughts on the big, beautiful bill. I know there's so much in there, and I think a lot of us are still trying to unpack that damn thing and figure out how bad it is. But what are some of the highlights that you're maybe concerned with from that federal legislation that passed recently?
Yeah, there's a lot in it to be concerned about, I would say, if you're a Nebraskan, if you're an American. But in particular for our state, the things that we're most concerned about are some changes that were made to the SNAP program, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be called food stamps, and some changes to the Medicaid program. And I think in the SNAP program, some of the changes that were made are really designed to be a cost shift to states. And so the federal government traditionally has covered the full cost of the benefits of SNAP that go out to folks, and 50% of the administrative costs. And what's been changed in the bill is a shift there where states are going to be asked to pick up a larger percentage of the cost of the SNAP program. And, what that means for a state like Nebraska, right? We just went through a legislative session that was a very tight budget. We had to pull a lot of money out of our cash reserve to kind of balance the budget. And so now we're going to go into a situation where we're going to have fewer federal dollars to do just what we've been currently doing. And that's going to create additional pressure, on the state budget. So we're really, concerned about that and how that will play out. There also, SNAP is a program that's always had work requirements. I think that's something that maybe people don't always know.
It's one of those myths. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, it's a program where you've always had a requirement to work. What it had built into it and what this bill changes is there were exemptions for certain populations, that folks that had higher needs. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to put into a work requirement. And so this bill kind of shifts that and says some of those categories, older Nebraskans up to age 64 now be required to meet those work requirements. Parents of young children, we used to give more time for parents to be able to stay home with their kids. and not be required to meet the full work requirement. But now we're saying, nope, we want you to go out and work right away. Former foster youth, which is a population of folks who really are often transitioning without a lot of support into being adults and not having any kind of foster care support any longer. So people experiencing homelessness, veterans, so folks, again, who are dealing with a lot of different kinds of challenges in their lives. And the program recognized that and said, we're going to give you a little bit of a different standard for when you are going to be required to work. So that's going away. And I think what the reality of when you have a work requirement that doesn't work for people is it pushes people off the program because they can't meet the requirement. And so it's a way of cutting programs that aren't a direct cut. And
self-cutting.
Yeah. And it's really, what we'll see is an increase in hunger in our communities. And I think when you think about folks that are in households, right? So some of these folks are living with other folks in their household. And if SNAP goes away for them as a household member, the amount of food the whole household has goes down. The amount of resources to buy food for the whole household goes down. And so it's not just, hitting these particular populations, but it's hitting the whole family. And we have a lot of amazing safety net programs in Nebraska, food banks and other groups who try to fill, unmet needs in addressing hunger as it is now. And they will across the board tell you they're having trouble meeting the current need. And so as we see, policies like this that will cut more people off of the program, those organizations are going to be asked to do more, and they aren't going to, have the resources necessarily to do that. So, it's pretty short-sighted. Most people that are on public benefits programs aren't on them for very long. The average amount of time folks spend on a public benefits program, especially if they are able to work or in a transitional period where they're going to regain the ability to work, it's about 16 months. And so, the idea that somehow this change is going to, get at some kind of bigger problem in the program is really misplaced. So that's SNAP, worried about where that's headed. Medicaid is the other one that there were changes made to the way that program operates. Again, Medicaid has been a program that has not had work requirements. And part of that is because 90% of the people on the program were working, who could work, were working.
Yeah.
And so, you don't usually pass laws for a tiny, percentage of folks on a program, but that's what we did here. And, the prediction, again, it's not a straight cut to that program. It's instituting work requirements that will lead to people who can't meet those requirements falling off the program. There's the estimate right now is about 40,000 folks will be at risk of losing coverage.
In Nebraska.
In Nebraska. Yeah, just in Nebraska. And, that's significant. And especially putting that in the context of, not that long ago, a majority of Nebraskans voted to do Medicaid expansion, which was specifically to provide Medicaid to, this population of able-bodied adults without, dependents. And so, now we have our members of Congress sort of forgetting that this was a priority for Nebraskans to make sure that these folks had health care. And the reason for it was they were otherwise uninsured. And there weren't ways for them to get coverage because often they're working in jobs that weren't providing insurance. They're working part-time so that, are cobbling together a couple of part-time jobs. And so, we're now going to be back in a situation where we could be dealing with a large number of uninsured Nebraskans. And that was a problem we all voted to solve. So I think that's really concerning. The devil will be in the details in terms of how the work requirements are implemented. We'll be doing a lot of advocacy around that. And I think one of the other, pieces around Medicaid, again, is a cut. Now, this one is an express, cut of Medicaid coverage for folks that met certain characteristics. So a lot of folks with varying immigration statuses, refugees, people with asylum, folks that were victims of domestic violence and trafficking, and people granted humanitarian protection. So these are all categories within our immigration system for folks who have experienced some kind of very difficult situation in their home country or as they came to the United States. And we said, we're going to take care of you because you've experienced this trauma. And now we're saying, we're not going to take care of you. And you're going to have to figure out how to manage your healthcare needs. And a lot of folks, if you've experienced trauma, you're tapping into healthcare services to help you move through that, whether it's therapy or medication. Some people have physical injuries. When you talk about folks who are refugees and may have been, escaping conflict, so it's a really short-sighted approach. And something, we'll continue to work to push back on all these changes. I think one thing I would say, it's easy to get discouraged in a moment like this where you see, forward progress that's been made, pulled back. And I think it's helpful to kind of ground ourselves in the reality that policy, the world of policy is kind of a shifting ground and a pendulum that swings,
Yes.
there's
Yes.
cycles to it. And when things sort of move back in a direction that's less helpful, there's always the opportunity to push back in the other direction. And it may take more time than any of us want. But it's another part of the reason why Appleseed exists. We're here for the long term. We're here to hold the memory of cuts that have been made and, continuing the fight to restore those cuts, especially ones that don't make sense and do harm in our communities.
Yeah. That's a tremendous recap, Becky. Thank you for that. Yeah, for me, it just goes back to we are better than that. We're a better people than that here in Nebraska. I'm not going to speak for anywhere. I've lived in this state my whole life, and we're better than that. We're a giving people. We also want accountability, but we are, and now to have our federal government and our Nebraska delegation just go along with these draconian measures. And it just, again, my political commentary, it just seems about the cruelty above everything else. So again, thank goodness that Appleseed and other organizations like you are keeping a watch on this and holding people to account for the long term. Okay, before we get out of here, I certainly want to talk about Nebraska issues specifically in the legislative issue. I know you guys were deeply involved in a very rankus at times, legislative session this past year. Give us some of the highlights, some good news and not so good news.
Yeah, I think it's, one of the things that's important, again, to keep in mind in these moments where it feels like, there's bad news in every direction. But there were actually two bills that passed this last session that we had been working on for a few years. And one of them was LB 192, which is connected to the SNAP program. And there had been an effort to kind of increase the eligibility limits so that once you go on the program, if you start working, there was a policy in place that people would refer to as the public benefits cliff. So as soon as you started kind of working and making a little bit more money, you'd sort of fall off the cliff and no longer be eligible for the program. And what this change did was kind of ease that transition for working families so that you didn't fall off the cliff right away. And so it increased the eligibility threshold for the program. When it was first put into place, there was a sunset period on it. And so the increase was going to sunset this summer if we didn't pass legislation to remove that sunset period. And so that's what LB 192 did. And it was great. There was a lot of support in the legislature. And again, one of these things where it's sort of common sense. And so bipartisan support across the legislature for this policy. And so that was one of the bright spots this last session. There was also a bill that we worked on connected to Social Security benefits for folks, young people that are in the child welfare system. And so another feature sometimes of public benefits programs is the state will come in and collect Social Security or other kinds of sources of income before they even get to the person. And that was one of the things that was happening is young people were having their Social Security captured by the state, and in many cases didn't even know they were getting Social Security. And so we had done some work to make sure that young people had notice. And now what LB 275 did was to set aside a portion of those Social Security benefits for the young person's benefit down the road. And so, we hope that can expand over time. And continue to make sure that young people who are going to be transitioning out of the child welfare system at some point have their resources available to them. So those were a couple of the bright spots. There were some disappointments. LB 319 is a bill we've worked on for, I want to say it's almost 7 years now, that would lift the lifetime ban within the SNAP program for people with a felony drug conviction. Yep. We have a partial ban that's in place in Nebraska. So there's some folks who are able to get back on the program if they complete some steps. But there's still a big chunk of people who are just banned from food access if they've ever had a felony drug conviction. And and it's the only kind of criminal history that can keep you off of SNAP.
Really?
So it kind of doesn't make sense. It's a holdover from a period of time where there were, the government was Congress was thinking about the war on drugs and kind of embedding into a lot of social policy, kind of drug policy. And this is one of those holdovers that, I don't think makes sense in the way that it operates and leaves folks, again, hungry. And in households where there's just fewer resources for food. We'll keep going with that until we get it fixed. And so we got very close this session. It was one of the bills that got vetoed. And so we'll keep working on it. The rollback of the paid sick leave ballot initiative was another really frustrating turn of events. And I think, it's rare to see a policy that 75% of Nebraskans support, and then the legislature, rolls back pieces of it. I do want to say, there's still the policy is still that Nebraskans voted for will go into effect October 1st. There's still a lot to that policy that's still in place, and so folks who are working at an employer with more than 10 employees will get the protections of the paid sick leave policy. And we'll be doing some more education around that. But really disheartening to see the legislature undercut, what voters did. And we'll continue to fight on that in some different ways down the road. But that's, it was really sad to see that happen.
Well, and that was one of the themes that emerged from this legislative session was there were three different issues that Nebraska voters threw the ballot box, in some cases overwhelmingly, like you said, 70%, more than 70%. Same thing with cannabis, medical cannabis. And there was, what was the other issue? Paid sick leave and
minimum wage.
Minimum wage. Thank you. Yes, that was the third one. Yeah. And so...
Hey, Chase Porter here, executive producer of The Dan Parsons Show. If you'd like to hear Becky's breakdown of Nebraska State Senator Jane Raybould's attempt to blunt yearly increases to Nebraska's minimum wage mandated by a vote of the people in 2022, become a friend of Dan and subscribe to The Dan Parsons Show on Patreon. For just $5 a month, you get access to bonus clips with our guests, and you're supporting our goal of platforming Nebraska voices. You can find a link to our Patreon in the podcast and YouTube description or at thedanparsonshow.com. Thank you all so much for your support.
Becky, have I missed anything? And then my second part of that question is, how can people get involved? How can people learn more about Appleseed? How can people get involved and be supportive of the work that you're doing?
Yeah. I think we've covered all the issues. I would just flag housing as one of the other big things.
Which you guys were very involved in the city election here this past spring.
The source of income discrimination ordinance that passed in Lincoln. And that's just a small piece of the broader, challenges we face statewide in access to affordable housing. So that's another issue that we are working on a lot, will continue to work on. But how people can get involved, we have you can go to our website, neappleseed.org, and we do have some email newsletters you can sign up for. One of them is our legislative update, which is one of the best ways to stay informed about policy issues that we're working on and when's a good time to call your senator and get engaged. You can also volunteer with us when we are, particularly when we're working on ballot initiatives and things like that. There's a huge need to have folks join in that process. And then certainly donate. We're a nonprofit organization, and so we rely on the support of really generous Nebraskans all across the state, and we'd love, to have folks support our work in that way as well. But my big ask for your listeners would be, don't stop engaging in the process, and don't stop fighting for the things that are needed most here in Nebraska, despite it feeling sometimes like, you're yelling into the void. I think a lot of us have had that feeling where there's something we really care about. We're talking to our leaders about it, and it doesn't feel like we get the response that we're looking for. But I think, getting to do this work for 2 decades, you see how these moments build. And when people's voices kind of add up together, it is powerful and it does make a difference. And so just encourage folks to continue using their voice, continue to stay engaged in the process, continue to vote in elections. They do matter. They have consequences for our communities. And to really try to develop relationships with your elected officials at all levels.
Yes.
They will tell you across the board how little they hear from people, actually. And so, the more you can be a known person in their office, the better. When they're back in the state, try to grab them in person, tell them your story, tell them about why these issues matter.
I think we lose track of that. I think in Nebraska, again, I can't speak for other states, but our elected officials are so accessible, from our state senators even to our congressional delegation. You can see them, you can interact with them. And I know the frustration of folks who, fire off another letter or another email or a phone call. I don't think it does any good. It does. They do notice. And so they are accessible. So I think that's a great point, Becky. So Becky Gould, thank you. Thank you for your decades of work in helping those less fortunate here in our state. And keep doing what you're doing, girl. It's important.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on the show. It's been my pleasure to be here, and my pleasure to do this work with so many amazing people. Nothing we do at Appleseed, nothing I've ever done in my career has been done alone. There's a lot of amazing advocates all across the state, and it's just such a privilege to get to do this work alongside them.
Yeah, you do have an amazing team, and you're always good to give them credit. So, Becky, thank you, and we'll do this again soon. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Hey, thanks, Becky, for joining us today, and thanks for all the great work your team at Nebraska Appleseed are doing. Thanks to the Parsons team who made this show possible. Chase Porter, our executive producer. Ike Samanis, producer and graphic design. Panology Tech Solutions for their technical help and equipment. And Kim Remington, Parsons PR's Director of Operations. And my sincere thanks to each of you for your support. Okay, that's today's show. Thanks for tuning in. Now go do good things. I'm Dan Parsons.